All right, this is part one of our measurement lecture, dealing with different kinds of measures and our approach to measurement. And this is one of the most important chapters because a lot of the things that we will be talking about and you'll be reading will be things that you will be using in your research projects. So let's first of all make a distinction between conceptual and operational definitions. So conceptual definitions of concepts, this is the definition of what a concept is. So it's an abstraction, kind of like something you might find in a dictionary. So here are some communication concepts and their conceptual definitions. So communication apprehension, that's defined as an individual's level of fear or anxiety associated with either real or anticipated communication with another person or persons. That's the definition of that concept. As I said, it's like you'd find in a dictionary. Communication style has been defined as an individual's characteristic way of communicating with others. Pick something else different. Product acceptance would be the perceived value of a product. Those would be just what the definitions are. When you are doing hypotheses and research questions, you're going to be wording those using these conceptual notions. So for example, you may have a hypothesis that says people with higher levels of communication apprehension will have a more reserved communication style relative to people who have low levels of communication apprehension. Or you might have a celebrity who endorses a product will generate more perceived value in that product than will a person listed in the ad as real person endorsing that product. So those would be things like, would be a hypothesis. And the way the research questions would work, you would do something like, what is the communication style of people who have high communication apprehension? Okay, and the first examples I gave you, these were predictions. In that question I just gave you there, you answer a question, and part of what you're trying to do, you ask a question, and part of what you're going to try to do is answer the question. Now, if these are the conceptual definitions, how are you going to operationalize those definitions so that you can actually collect data representing those concepts? And that's where the operational definitions come in. What does the concept look like? How is it observed? So earlier I gave you the conceptual definition of communication apprehension. Well, how would I know it? How would I know it if I were to see it? So we have a measure that is established measure in which it's a self-report item where people respond to questions related to things like I feel relaxed when giving a speech, I'm afraid to express my opinion at meetings, and things like that. You could also perhaps define communication apprehension by observing nonverbal behaviors. Is a person talking with a high rate of speed or with a high pitch in their voice? Do they seem to be shaking and so showing some nervousness? That could be another measure of communication apprehension. Communication style, you could have the one that exists in the literature is a 40-item self-report that people fill out. Questions like, I'm comfortable with all varieties of people, I laugh easily, I readily express my admiration for others, etc. If I were to talk about speech rate, so if I were to talk about how fast one talks, so if that was my conceptual definition of speech rate, it would be the rate at which one speaks, something very simple. How would I measure that? Well, my operationalization of speech rate might be how many words a minute are they speaking? And then product acceptance, in the example I used earlier, might be whether or not the product was purchased. The perceived value of the product, how would we know that? Well, whether or not people purchase that product. So that's what the operational definitions do. You work at hypotheses and research questions with regard to these these concepts, and then when you are going to look and collect data, you're going to then see how those measures or how those concepts are operationalized in your research. All right, now we will oftentimes refer to these things, both types of definitions, as variables. All you need to know about variables is it represents, it's a reference to something that varies. Usually it's a high or low of something. It's a different type of something. So every variable will have some elements of different levels. So we'll use that word a lot, variables, and those variables will be the things that you will be thinking about when you put together your hypotheses and research questions. So now let's look at different types of measures or levels of measures. First, we have nominal variables. These are variables that are represented by distinct categories. So you have gender, and your options might be male or female. If you have race, African American, Hispanic, Asian, Caucasian. These could also be variables which is there yes or no to the answer, a present or an absence to the measure. So these would be things in which the variable is measured by which category you fit in. So like political affiliation, it might be Republican, Democratic, Independent, and whatever else. Those are nominal. Categories are represented by different types. Now, ordinal is rank order. So this is where you rank something from best to least. So you may be given, say, a list of TV shows and rank these in terms of the ones you like the best versus those you like the least. Or here are some persuasive strategies that you could use. Which ones do you think would be the most effective? Rank order them down to which ones you think might be the least effective. Or movie preferences. Rank order the following 5 movies in terms of which you would like what you'd like to see most. So the thing about a rank order is it does not assume, these are rank orders to the highest to the lowest, to the best to the least, those kinds of things. It doesn't necessarily assume that there's equidistance between first to second, second to third, and things like that. So for example, I might say my favorite movie is Forrest Gump. And then I may say my second favorite movie is Lord of the Rings. And then I may say my third favorite movie is Lonesome Dove. So what I would do is I might say, yeah, I'm really, really like Forrest Gump, and I almost like as much Lord of the Rings, but it's a little bit below Forrest Gump. And then a little bit further down is Lonesome Dove. What's important is not the distance between what counts as first, second, or third. It's their relative position to one another. Here's the top one. Here's the next, on down to the last. Those are ordinal variables. Now at the interval level, these are the ones you're probably most familiar with. These would be like the Likert scales, and many of you have participated in research where you're given a survey or a questionnaire or something like that, and you're to respond, for example, on the degree to which you agree or disagree with a statement. So you might have an item that says, I'm reluctant to discuss my personal life with a stranger, and you're to respond on a scale of 1 to 5, whether you strongly agree, moderately agree, not sure, moderately disagree, strongly disagree, something like that. I got the information I needed when I needed it. Again, strongly agree, all the way down to strongly disagree. Now, in an these are the Likert scales. These are the ones where you're given a statement and then you're given a set of response options with regard to how you feel about that statement. All right, and again, mostly, though not always, we'll see in a minute, there in the statement is made, to what extent do you agree with it? Now, another one that you will likely use or could use is the semantic differential scale. And these are the ones that have polar opposites at each end of the scale. So you're not talking about whether or not you agree with something or not. Rather, you're talking about the attributes of something. So what is your impression of the person you just met? Well, you might have a scale between 1 to 5 that starts out with hostile at one end and friendly at the other end, and then you mark whether or not you see it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 along that scale. Then you might also be asked to think, how active are they versus passive? How dependent are they versus independent? So the thing about Likert scales is you tend to be given a statement and you're to ask to what extent you kind of agree or disagree with it. Whereas semantic differential scales, you're given an object to assess, and then what you are to do is on a series of scales that represent polar opposites, mark your impression of it. And before I talk about ratio measurement, another thing I'll mention about interval scales is, remember when I talked about ordinal scales, that there's no assumption that the space between 1 and 2 is the same distance as the space between the second and the third rank. Rather, it's just their position to one another. With an interval scale, the assumption is that the distance between the numbers are equal distance. And reason this really won't matter that much to you, but the reason why it does is it depends on what kinds of statistical operations you can use. So if I strongly agree on one item, and then I say something like I am not sure on another, and the first one I gave an example was 1, and then I circled in the second one 3. Those would be 2 units apart from one another, because the distance between 1 and 2 is the same distance as between 2 and 3 and 4, and the like. Now when we get into ratio measurement, this is really what we're talking about are frequencies and proportions. You know, you think of a ratio, you think of a proportion. You think of the ratio of how much I talk relative to how much you talk. That is a ratio measure. But how much you talk, how often you are doing certain things is also falls into this category. So it's pretty easy. Frequencies, how often, how many times did something occur? This could be you're listening to a job interview. How many questions did the interviewee ask? Some people do real close nonverbal analysis. The number of eye blinks that a person had during a minute of the conversation. Could be the number of job offers that a person got, number of products sold, number of violent scenes in a movie. So frequencies are pretty common used in measurement. Probably the ones that you will probably be most involved with is if you do something where you're observing, say, a group interacting, you may want to be coding how often certain members do certain types of communicative acts. Or those of you that may want to do a media analysis may look at the number of times that there was an act of violence in a TV show, or the number of times there was an alcohol-related commercial during a TV show, or something like that. All right, so those are frequencies, but you also have proportions that fall under here. And that's how often something occurred in relation to another variable. It could be time, or it could be another measure, for example, another behavior. So it could be things like words per minute, proportion of the conversation that was in the form of a self-disclosure, how much I talked relative to you during our conversation, proportion of sales by a person relative to the total number of sales by the company. If you look at what videos people are watching, how many videos did they watch that were from YouTube versus the overall number of videos that they watched in total. Those would be examples of proportions, and those are examples of ratio measurement.